Welcome back to the Razor Crest series, and in this video we're going to continue doing some compositing inside of After Effects, and then going back to Maya to correct some issues before we do our final render. Alright, let's get started. Alright, so at this point what I'd like to do is show you the differences now between what we had before and what the master scene beauty right out of Maya looked like. So notice now how we've added a lot more depth to the scene, we've changed the color, we've made the ship stand out a little bit more, and more attention now is on the cockpit of the ship. So you can see the power of compositing here. Now you have some artistic freedom that if you didn't want it to be as bright as this, you can make it darker, and that's fine to do as well. All right, so I think this looks pretty good. Also notice that adding that blur has kind of got rid of some of that graininess. So what I'd like to do at this point, before we separate our environment out into all the different passes, which we might still want to do, like especially here, we see a lot of that depth of field is causing some hot spots there to be out of focus. We also might want to be able to animate our depth of field. So while this is in focus, we probably want to be able to change the depth of field a little bit. All right, so I'm going to preview this and then take a look at what we have so far. So this is the full shot without the dust. So you can see there's like a weird reflection on the bottom of the ship here as we come in. It's like much darker, but there's nothing there to kind of occlude it. I think that's from the dust, so let's not worry about that. Unfortunately for the cliffs here, it is still really grainy, even with that blur defocus on it. And there's a few other things that we could do with the depth, but I'd like to do a different lecture on depth compositing that we can use with it, because I don't think it's particularly necessary for this shot. But if you wanted this to be very foggy, for example, that would be a good application of using some atmospherics or depth. But the ship is so low anyway, and it's already pretty much at the height of this cliff face here, that we wouldn't really need that. It would be cool to show you, but it would probably be better done in Maya anyway. So we'll leave that for a different lecture. Okay, so this looks pretty good, but what we need to do now is separate out the cliffs, or basically our environment, into all of the different passes. There's no quick way to do this. We just gotta use Extractor to the same thing that we did before, and just make sure our environment is separated. So I'm gonna fast forward through this part because we've done this now several times, but you just wanna make sure that you start off with the environment GI, and then you work your way up. Okay, so now we have our passes for the environment. So we got GI, we have lighting, we have the specular light. Refraction is actually completely black because there's nothing refractive on the environment. So this is something that we can delete, and we can delete it from Maya as well. We don't need it to bother saving that out because it is going to kind of waste a little bit of time, but we definitely don't need it in our composition because it is wasting resources having a layer that's just completely black. And if we zoom in here, you can see that there is adding a little bit of shadow to the environment. So it's up to you if you want to include that. I'm going to include it, but I think for the most part, the environment is not as important to change, but it does allow you now, if you wanted to, use a curves or an exposure node or something and increase the direct lighting. You could do something like that if you wanted to. It kind of makes everything just have a little bit more depth to it. Personally though, I'm pretty happy with where it is, but if you decided later on that you wanted to make this more overcast, it'd be very easy just to drop down the direct light. But you could add a little bit of boost to that if you wanted to. Same thing with the GI. So let's say that you really wanted this to be very overcast. You could take your lighting layer, just basically turn that off. On our global illumination, you could really increase that. Like let's say you wanted to do something that was very, very dark, like almost like complete overcast. You could do just your global illumination, because there's not going to be very much direct light in that case if the sun is completely obscured by the clouds. This allows you to make those changes and even swap out your sky without necessarily having to re-render this. So just keep that in mind. Also for your specularity here, you could turn off those hotspots, and that would also allow it to be a lot more overcast. With that said, you can't make part of your environment look like it's in a completely different lighting environment. Like you can have your rocks look like it's overcast and your ship look like it's not, because we can see the highlights there. But it's just something that you can now break apart if you wanted to have a lot more control. I'm gonna go back to the GI though. I don't really want to have any more bounce light. You might, if very, very slightly, you could boost the GI very slightly like that. And it would probably look just fine. Like down here, if you think that that's getting too lost in shadow, you could boost that up a little bit if you want to. Personally, I do think that looks good because we boosted the reflections on the ship. So by leaving this so dark, it kind of looks a little awkward that we're getting a lot more light from here and around the edges here. That kind of makes more sense like that. So I'm going to leave that with a small adjustment on the GI and a small adjustment on the direct lighting pass. So if I toggle that on and off, you can see we've made it a little bit brighter. These are pretty trivial changes though. It's not particularly important for this. The biggest changes that we need to do are for the ship. And we still need to separate them out though, because now you can see that the denoising has been applied. So if we take any one of these layers like AO, let's call this beauty, delete the extractor, and then I'll set this to be normal. You can see the amount of grain difference. Probably more evident when it's moving or when you don't look at the blur. If I turn this off like this, you can see the amount of grain in the beauty. Okay. Now for me, I don't need this environment beauty layer at all. You can use it there as reference if you want, but you have to turn it off. I'm just going to delete it. So I'm going to now turn on the dust again, just so we can see what that is. Let's go back into Maya and then start to make some adjustments to the scene so we can render out another pass and hopefully the final pass. All right, let's go back into Maya. And right away, we want to up version this. So I want to say version 2. The landing version 2, like that. Then the next thing you need to do is go into your common tab in render settings and increase the version label here to be version 2. Let's say you did something wrong on your second pass and you completely ruined something and it's too late to turn it in. You want to make sure you have your previous pass that you could use. If there's a problem with that too, then, well, that doesn't help you, but there have been so many cases where if you accidentally overwrite something that was actually good and you make it worse, well, now you have to re-render again anyway. So make sure you up version this to a version 2 or whatever version of scene that you're using. This should match. If we had made changes in After Effects and we were on version 5, even though that there's no version 5 of our scene, we would make a version 5 and we would up version this to version 5. So it's okay to have a gap, but the point is anytime that you render out new frames, that should match whatever After Effects is, and After Effects should be using the same frames as Maya. Okay, so let's say you go to version 5 in After Effects and the client likes that one, but it's been a few days or a few weeks and you need to go and double check to see that you're using the right frames. So let's say version 5 was good. You would say, hey, look, I'm using ship version 5. Then you would go to the version 5 of that scene. Even if there's a gap and there is no version 2, 3, or 4, that's fine. Now, of course, there will be stuff towards the end where you will up version your After Effects comp, like I said. You might have version 6, 7, 8. So let's say for version 8 in After Effects, you needed to render out a change in Maya. Then in Maya, you would create a version 8 of your scene and render out version 8 of frames. Okay, so make sure you have that set, because the next time we render that out, you want to make sure that these two numbers are the same. All right, so hopefully that makes sense. If you have any questions, just ask me. We'll leave the animation mode disabled for right now. And then the first thing I wanted to do, let's actually go to the environment, which I happen to be on already. We don't need the refraction channel because there's nothing on the material for the rocks that refracts, so we don't need a pass for it. So what we can do here is just click this button and it will disable that pass. This will turn to a no. Sometimes it's a little bit laggy, so sometimes you have to go back to a different layer to check to make sure it's still in the ship, which it is. Go back to your environment here, and you can see that that is disabled, and this is now no. Okay, we do need to have that. We also need to make an adjustment on our dust. So let's go to our dust layer. And for this, I did want to enable the denoiser for our dust layer. So we're going to select the denoiser pass, right click over enabled, create an override for it, turn that back on. So to properly test the denoiser, we want to go back to our V-Ray tab, and then we need to lower our threshold to something a lot more reasonable. In this case, I'll do 0.05, which is going to take a lot longer to render, but it's going to be a lot cleaner with the denoising. I'm going to go back to my common tab, just make sure the animation mode is disabled. Then I'm going to render just one frame at 160 because there's a lot of dust on this frame. And then we can see the result of the denoiser. So this looks very, very grainy, even when it started to render here. Although this is better to work with. So by lowering the threshold, we do have a lot better looking dust to begin with. And if you wait a few seconds after that, it's going to run its denoiser pass. There might be some weird issues that you see. Lowering the threshold will reduce this even more, but I would be fine with this level of quality. Okay, so that works and everything is good to go there. I also mentioned that I wanted to offset the dust animation because it kind of ends too soon. So let's do that really fast. We'll select the dust VDB. I'll go up to the graph editor. And right now we have it set so it starts at frame 0 and it ends at frame 248. But I mentioned I wanted to offset this by at least 2 seconds. So what we could do, we could say we wanted this to start at frame 24. We can just select that frame, have it start a little bit later, and then we could have this end 2 seconds later. So it could end at 296 instead, just to pull those off a little bit more. We still have it kind of ramping up, and then it's going to ease out later, but this part's going to be pretty linear, but it's going to kind of ramp up. If you wanted this to be all linear, that's fine. Doesn't really matter. I'm going to have a little bit of a curve. Basically, I just want more of the dust later on. So if we go to the end here, we should be able to see quite a bit more dust in the render. All right, so I'm going to go back to the master scene here and then just render one frame of the IPR. It's kind of hard to tell on the dust layer just on itself if it's looking good. So we want to make sure that it looks fine in the master scene with all the other geometry. And we don't want to have too much dust, but we want to have, a fair amount of dust. This might actually be a little bit more than we want. It's up to you though. If you want to have a little bit more of the dust gone at this point, what we could do, we could stop the IPR, go back to our graph editor. We could have this start at frame 1 again. To it to start a little bit earlier, or we could have it end a little bit earlier. I'll just put it back to the original start time, and then we'll take a comparison to see if the thickness is all right. Now we can always adjust that in After Effects, but it is going to affect the shading of the ship a little bit. So you have some leeway to affect the opacity, but if you dropped it to 0, but it's still casting shadows on the ship, that would look a little bit incorrect. So I think this is going to look okay with this amount of dust. I think I'll be happy with that. All right, so I'm going to now go to the ship layer, and we do need to figure out what to do with the ground plane here with our displacement. So this should be occluding the landing gear, and right now it's not. So what we're going to do, instead of using the dust and rocks VDB like this, we're actually going to make a change here. So this is going to depend on your scene. If the Cryptomatte and using like an actual Luma matte in After Effects works, then you don't need to do this. But if you want to make sure that your ship is landing properly on the ground with no ground existing there, this is what we're going to solve. Very first thing on the dust and rocks, I'm just going to call this dust. Okay, because I don't need the rocks in here, so I can remove that element from our layer. On the dust and rock shapes, I don't need this entire collection. I can just click delete. So I have one for the Razor Crest, so I'll just call this collection ship. And because we already have a collection in our render layers called ship in one of these other ones, this is why it says ship 2, dust 2, that's fine. We can right click over our layer, create a new collection, and this will be for our environment or our rocks. So we'll just say rocks. And then we're going to grab the rocks, we'll add that collection in there. And then on this collection, we're going to create a material override. So material override, and we're just going to use that material wrapper that we used before. And for our matte, we're going to say matte surface alpha contribution is going to be -1. We don't need it to cast or shadows or affect the alpha. So let's go to the very last frame here, frame 200, and then let's just render one frame with this and just see if this is correct. And when I deleted that collection, I also deleted the override for the dust. So really fast, back to our dust right here. Select our dust VDB, go to the volume grid, render stats, and I accidentally deleted the primary visibility. Let's overwrite that. Now you can see that that's being added. So, whoops. All right, let's try that one more time. So when that is pretty much done rendering, we can select our alpha, and then you can see that it's cut out properly. It's exactly what we want, and it still is collecting shadows from here. I'm gonna turn off the lens effects there. For whatever reason on GPU mode, sometimes lens effects and denoising can lead to some weird results. So if you find that and you are on GPU mode, just disable them from the frame buffer. But this looks pretty good. If I wanted to just brighten this up just to check. See? That's all good there, and we're still getting all the shadows and everything. So, okay, everything is good there. So that's a pretty quick fix. We should have just done that to begin with. All right, so now we are ready for that. I did want to make an animation change on mine. I'm going to go over to a perspective viewport and just have a look. I don't like how it dips down like that. I think it looks kind of silly. So at frame 52, it kind of does that dip. I want to pull this up so it's not going to dip down so much. A little bit of that is fine. I just don't want it to be ridiculous. And you could even do something else, like at frame 52, maybe it's going to be more on this side or something. Or frame 96 or something, we just dip it a little bit this way. Also on our camera, the composition is getting a little bit close, so I'll select the camera. And right here at a frame, looks like 108-ish. We just need to dip that down a little bit to keep that more in frame. Something more like that, I think, is going to be a little bit better. Keep in mind that you are graded on the animation of this, but I'm not going to be super hardcore with it. I just want to make sure that you are using the graph editor and your keyframes aren't perfectly linear everywhere. We do want to do stuff like linearize maybe the front part of these, so it can already be in motion right at the very beginning. It's not going to ease into it. And there should be a little bit of a bounce and flare, so it flares back and then it bounces down. My bounce is a bit over the top. You wouldn't need it to like hit the ground and like shake as much, but something like that is going to be okay. All right, so there's one other thing I wanted to check here, and that's the lens flare. All right, so I'm going to go right to the very end here, and then I'm going to go back to IPR because I realized I wanted to change the lens effects. I made the size of the lens flare just a little bit too large, and I want to reduce that. So I want to make this the default 30 instead of 40. I think that will look a little bit more subtle and just a little bit better. Okay, so when you make adjustments to your lens effects, you do that in the frame buffer, and it uses whatever settings are here to render the pass. And as long as this is enabled here, you will get a glare render pass. Okay, that's good. So other adjustments that we need to make on our dust, I forgot while we were on here. There was a weird part on mine where there was like an odd highlight. And I don't know what was causing it, but let's just go back to the IPR, and you can see that it looks like the sun or something is like reflecting. We got like a weird white spot there on our dust. So make sure you're on the dust layer for this. If you see something odd like that, what we're going to do, we're just going to select our sun, because it looks like that is the sun. I don't know what is causing that bug, but we're just going to create an absolute override for it and then set the size to 0. I think that's going to be fine. If I go back to IPR now, hopefully that goes away. And if it does, we're good. If it's still there, okay, it's gone. Cool. So it must be something to do with the VDB and having the sun size there. I have no idea. That looks like a bug to me. So if you see something weird like that, set your size multiplier just on the dust layer to be 0, because this is what controls the size of the sun. Okay, so I think that's pretty much good on that. Thanks for watching. In the next video, we're going to go over how to add clouds to our sky.